The old grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, its deep resonance echoing through the cavernous halls of Blackwood Manor. Grace Johnson, her hands raw from scrubbing floors, straightened her aching back and wiped a bead of sweat from her brow. At 45, she felt twice her age, worn down by years of thankless labor in this opulent house. She cast a weary glance at her reflection in the polished marble floor. Her once vibrant auburn hair was now streaked with gray, pulled back in a tight bun. Deep lines etched her face, a testament to years of early mornings and late nights spent tending to the whims of the Blackwood family. As Grace gathered her cleaning supplies, the sound of expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor made her tense. Richard Blackwood, the master of the house, rounded the corner. His tailored suit probably cost more than Grace made in a year. "Johnson," he barked, not bothering to use her first name. "My office needs attention, now." Grace bit back a sigh. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood, right away, sir." Richard's lip curled in disgust as he glanced at her bucket. "And for heaven's sake, try not to leave streaks this time. I have important clients coming." Without waiting for a response, he strode away, leaving Grace to trail behind him like a shadow. As she entered his massive office, Grace couldn't help but marvel at the opulence. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the manicured grounds. Rare artifacts and priceless artwork adorned every surface. Grace set to work, dusting each item with care. Her movements were practiced, efficient. She'd been cleaning this office for over 2 decades, long enough to know every inch of it. As she approached Richard's imposing mahogany desk, her elbow caught the edge of a stack of papers. They scattered across the floor, and Grace's heart leapt into her throat. She scrambled to gather them, praying Richard wouldn't choose this moment to return. Among the fallen documents, an old, yellowed envelope caught her eye. The paper was brittle, the ink faded. Grace's fingers trembled as she picked it up, a strange feeling of dread washing over her. She knew she shouldn't. It was a massive breach of privacy, grounds for immediate dismissal. But something about the letter called to her. With a furtive glance at the door, Grace carefully extracted the contents. Her eyes widened as she read, her mouth going dry. The letter detailed a complex web of fraud, extortion, and illegal dealings that had built the Blackwood fortune decades ago. Names of ruined families, falsified documents, and staggering sums of money jumped out at her. Grace's mind reeled. The Blackwoods, pillars of the community, renowned for their charitable giving, it was all built on lies, on the suffering of others. A noise in the hallway made Grace jump. She hastily shoved the letter back into its envelope and returned it to the pile, her heart pounding. She resumed her cleaning with shaking hands, her mind a whirlwind of shock and disbelief. For the rest of the day, Grace went through her tasks in a daze. The weight of what she'd discovered pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. She'd always known the Blackwoods weren't kind people, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. As she prepared dinner that evening, Grace's thoughts raced. What should she do? Could she live with herself if she kept this secret? But if she spoke up, who would believe a mere housekeeper over the mighty Blackwoods? The sound of raised voices from the dining room broke through her reverie. Richard was berating his wife, Catherine, again. Grace winced at the cruel words, all too familiar with Richard's temper. "You embarrassed me in front of the McGraths," Richard shouted. "Do you have any idea how important that deal was?" Catherine's softer voice was barely audible. "I'm sorry, Richard. I didn't mean to." "You never mean to." Richard cut her off. "Sometimes I wonder why I even keep you around." Grace's grip tightened on the serving tray. She'd witnessed countless such arguments over the years, always pretending not to hear. But now, knowing what she knew about the true source of Richard's wealth, his cruelty seemed even more abhorrent. Taking a deep breath, Grace pushed through the swinging door into the dining room. Richard's face was flushed with anger, while Catherine sat hunched in her chair, eyes downcast. "Your dinner, Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood," Grace announced, carefully setting out the plates. Richard barely spared her a glance. "It's about time. Now leave us." As Grace turned to go, she caught Catherine's eye. The woman looked utterly defeated, a shadow of the vivacious young bride who had first come to Blackwood Manor. In that moment, Grace made her decision. She couldn't stay silent, not anymore. The next morning, Grace arrived at work early, her resolve firm. She would confront Richard, appeal to whatever shred of decency might still exist in him. It was a risk, but she had to try. She found Richard in his study, already poring over financial reports. He frowned at her unexpected appearance. "What is it, Johnson? I'm busy." Grace clasped her hands to stop them from shaking. "Mr. Blackwood, sir, there's something I need to discuss with you. It's about a letter I found yesterday, about the origin of your family's fortune." Richard's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "What did you say?" "I know I shouldn't have read it," Grace pressed on, her voice gaining strength. "But now that I have, I can't ignore it. All those people who were hurt, whose lives were ruined, don't you think it's time to make things right?" For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Then, slowly, he rose from his chair. When he spoke, his voice was low and menacing. "You dare to threaten me? In my own house?" He advanced on Grace, who instinctively took a step back. "I could destroy you with a single phone call. Who do you think anyone would believe? A wealthy businessman or a nosy maid who can't mind her own business?" Grace stood her ground, though her knees felt weak. "It's not about me, Mr. Blackwood. It's about doing what's right. Think of your legacy, your children." "Enough," Richard roared. "You're fired. Get out of my house immediately or I'll have you thrown out." Grace's world spun. She'd known this was a possibility, but the reality of it was still a shock. "Sir, please." "And if I hear a single word about this from anyone," Richard continued, his face inches from hers, "I'll make sure you never work again. Are we clear?" Grace's shoulders slumped in defeat. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood." As she turned to leave, her eyes burning with unshed tears, Richard's voice stopped her. "Johnson." She looked back, a tiny flicker of hope igniting in her chest. Had she gotten through to him after all? Richard's face was a cold mask. "I want you gone in an hour. And if you take so much as a paperclip that doesn't belong to you, I'll have you arrested for theft." The tiny flame of hope extinguished. Grace nodded once and left the study, her mind reeling. As she packed her meager belongings, her thoughts were a jumble of fear and anger. What would she do now? Where would she go? But beneath it all, a steely resolve began to form. She might have lost this battle, but the war wasn't over. Somehow, some way, she would expose the truth. The Blackwoods. Victims deserved justice, and Grace was now more sure than ever that she would be the one to get it for them. As she took one last look at Blackwood Manor, the home that had been the center of her life for so long, Grace squared her shoulders. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. "You can't silence the truth forever, Richard," she murmured. "One day, it will come out, and I'll make sure I'm there to see it." With that, Grace turned her back on Blackwood Manor and stepped into an uncertain future, carrying with her a secret that would change everything. As Grace walked down the long driveway, a sleek black car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, revealing Catherine Blackwood's worried face. "Grace, what's going on? Why do you have your suitcase?" Grace hesitated, torn between her loyalty to Catherine and her anger at the family's deception. "I've been let go, Mrs. Blackwood. Your husband, he wasn't pleased with my work." Catherine's brow furrowed. "That doesn't sound right. You've been with us for years. Please get in. Let's talk about this." Grace hesitated, her hand on the car door. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm not sure that's a good idea. Mr. Blackwood was quite clear about wanting me gone." Catherine's eyes flashed with a rare spark of defiance. "Never mind what Richard wants. I'm asking you to get in the car, Grace. Please." Reluctantly, Grace slid into the back seat. The leather was cool and soft, a stark contrast to the worn fabric of her own clothes. Catherine instructed the driver to take them to the garden house, a secluded spot on the vast Blackwood property. As they rode in silence, Grace couldn't help but study Catherine. The woman had always been kind to her, in a distant sort of way. Now she seemed different. There was a tension in her shoulders, a tightness around her eyes that spoke of inner turmoil. The garden house was a quaint cottage, surrounded by a riot of colorful flowers. Inside it was cozy and welcoming. a far cry from the imposing grandeur of the main house. Catherine gestured for Grace to sit on a floral-patterned sofa. "Now," Catherine said, settling into an armchair across from her, "tell me what really happened." Grace took a deep breath. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm not sure you want to hear this." "I think I do," Catherine replied, her voice gentle but firm. "And please, call me Catherine. I think we're beyond formalities now." Haltingly, Grace recounted the events of the past 2 days. As she spoke, she watched Catherine's face carefully. The other woman's expression shifted from confusion to shock, and finally to a deep, weary sadness. When Grace finished, Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed, a sound full of pain and resignation. "I've suspected for years that there was something not right about the family's wealth, but I never imagined it was this bad." "You believe me?" Grace asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Catherine smiled ruefully. "Oh, Grace, I've been married to Richard for 25 years. I know what he's capable of." She paused, her gaze distant. "What I don't know is what to do about it." Grace leaned forward, her heart pounding. "We have to expose him, Catherine. Think of all the people who were hurt. They deserve justice." "It's not that simple," Catherine said, shaking her head. "Richard is a powerful man. He has connections everywhere. If we move against him, he'll crush us. So we do nothing?" Grace felt her anger rising again. "We just let him get away with it?" Catherine's eyes met hers, and Grace was startled by the steel she saw there. "I didn't say that. I said it's not simple. We need to be smart about this. Careful." For the next hour, the two women talked strategy. Catherine, it turned out, had a sharp mind for planning. She'd spent years observing Richard's business dealings, filing away bits of information that now proved invaluable. "We need proof," Catherine said, pacing the small room. "Concrete evidence that can't be disputed or buried." Grace nodded. "The letter I found is a start, but you're right. We need more." "I think I know where to look," Catherine said. "Richard has a safe in his private study. I've seen him access it late at night when he thinks I'm asleep. Whatever's in there, he wants to keep it hidden." Grace felt a glimmer of hope. "Can you get into it?" Catherine's smile was grim. "I've been Richard's dutiful wife for a quarter century. I know things about him that would make your hair curl, including the combination to that safe." They spent the rest of the afternoon planning. Catherine would return to the main house, playing the role of the oblivious wife. She would gather what information she could and work on accessing the safe. Grace, meanwhile, would reach out to some of the people mentioned in the letter, trying to build a network of witnesses. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Catherine stood. "We should head back. Richard will be wondering where I am." Grace rose as well, feeling a newfound kinship with this woman she'd served for so long. "Catherine, thank you for believing me, for helping." Catherine's eyes were sad but determined. "Thank you for having the courage to speak up, Grace. It's long past time someone did." As they walked back to the car, Catherine suddenly stopped. "Oh, I almost forgot. We need to get you set up somewhere safe, somewhere Richard won't think to look." Grace hadn't even considered that. I don't have much savings. I was planning to stay with my sister in the city, but—" "Absolutely not," Catherine cut her off. "That's the first place Richard would check." She thought for a moment, then nodded decisively. "I have a small apartment in town. It's under a different name. Richard doesn't know about it. It's yours for as long as you need it." Grace was overwhelmed by the offer. "Catherine, I can't accept—" "You can and you will," Catherine insisted. "We're in this together now, Grace. Partners." As they drove back towards the main house, Grace felt a mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. Fear, certainly. Anger still simmering beneath the surface, but also a strange excitement, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. They pulled up to the grand entrance of Blackwood Manor. Before she got out, Catherine turned to Grace. "Be careful. Trust no one but me. We'll be in touch soon." Grace nodded, clutching the keys to the apartment Catherine had pressed into her hand. As she watched the car disappear up the winding driveway, she took a deep breath of the cool evening air. For the first time in decades, she was unemployed, facing an uncertain future. But she also felt more alive than she had in years. She had a mission now, a wrong to right. As she turned to leave, Grace cast one last look at the imposing facade of Blackwood Manor. Its windows glowed with warm light, a beacon of wealth and privilege. But now she knew the rot that lay beneath that gilded exterior. "Your days are numbered, Richard Blackwood," she murmured. "Justice is coming." With that, Grace stepped into the gathering darkness, ready to begin her new life as more than just a housekeeper. She was now a woman on a mission, and nothing would stand in her way. As she walked away from the only home she'd known for years, Grace's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She opened it to find a message from Catherine. "Meeting tomorrow noon, the old boathouse by the lake. Come alone." Grace typed back a quick "understood" before deleting the message. As she pocketed her phone, she couldn't help but wonder what new revelations tomorrow might bring. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Grace woke early in the small apartment Catherine had provided, her mind already racing with plans and possibilities. She'd spent half the night poring over notes she'd secretly taken over the years, searching for any clue that might help their cause. As the clock ticked closer to noon, Grace made her way to the old boathouse by the lake. It was a dilapidated structure, long abandoned and forgotten by the Blackwoods, the perfect place for a clandestine meeting. She arrived early, her nerves on edge. Every rustle in the bushes made her jump. What if Richard had discovered their plan? What if this was all an elaborate trap? Just as Grace was considering fleeing, she heard footsteps approaching. She tensed, ready to run, but relaxed when she saw Catherine's familiar figure emerge from the trees. "Sorry I'm late," Catherine said, slightly out of breath. "Richard was being difficult this morning." Grace nodded in understanding. "Are you okay?" Catherine waved away her concern. "I'm fine. More importantly, I have news." She pulled a small USB drive from her pocket. "I got into the safe last night." Grace's eyes widened. "Already? That's incredible. What did you find?" "Everything," Catherine said, her voice low and intense. "Bank statements, correspondence, even a sort of ledger. It details every illegal transaction, every person they blackmailed or swindled. It's all here, Grace." Grace felt a surge of excitement. "This is it then. We can take this to the authorities, blow the whole thing wide open." But Catherine shook her head, her expression grim. "It's not that simple. There are names in here, Grace. Powerful people, judges, politicians, business leaders. If we're not careful, this could be buried before it ever sees the light of day." Grace's heart sank. "So what do we do?" Catherine's eyes gleamed with determination. "We build our case, quietly, carefully. We reach out to the victims, gather more evidence. And when we're ready, we don't just go to the police, we go public. All at once, so big and loud that it can't be ignored or covered up." For the next hour, they pored over the files Catherine had stolen. The scope of the Blackwoods' crimes was staggering. It wasn't just Richard's father who had built the fortune on illegal dealings. Richard himself had continued the practice, expanding it to new heights. "Look at this," Grace said, pointing to a particular entry. "The Harrison family, I remember them. They used to own that big factory on the edge of town. It shut down about 10 years ago." Catherine nodded. "According to this, Richard orchestrated their downfall. Falsified safety reports, bribed inspectors. He bought the factory for pennies on the dollar after it went bankrupt." Grace felt sick. All those people who lost their jobs, their livelihoods. "We'll make it right," Catherine said firmly. "Somehow, we'll make it right." As they were wrapping up their meeting, a sudden noise outside made them both freeze. Footsteps coming closer. "Quick," Catherine whispered, shoving the USB drive into Grace's hand. "Hide this. If it's Richard, I'll distract him. You slip away." Grace barely had time to pocket the drive before the boathouse door creaked open. But it wasn't Richard who entered. It was a young man, probably in his early 20s, with Richard's sharp features but softer eyes. "Mom," he said, looking bewildered. "What are you doing out here?" Catherine recovered quickly. "James, darling, you startled us." "I was just showing Grace some of the old property. For nostalgia's sake? James looked skeptical. In the old boathouse? And isn't Grace supposed to be gone? Dad said he fired her. Grace and Catherine exchanged a quick glance. This was a complication they hadn't anticipated. James, Catherine said slowly, there's something we need to talk about. Something important. About your father and our family. James's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Over the next half hour, Catherine and Grace carefully explained the situation to James. They watched as his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to a sort of horrified understanding. I can't believe it, he said finally, his voice hoarse. All those charity events, the scholarships, it was all built on lies. I'm so sorry, James, Catherine said, reaching out to touch his arm. I know this must be a terrible shock. James was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. Then he looked up, his jaw set in a determined line that reminded Grace forcefully of his mother. What can I do to help? He asked. Grace and Catherine shared a surprised look. Are you sure? Grace asked. This could get very messy, James. Your whole life could change. It already has, James said firmly. I can't unknow this, and I can't stand by and do nothing. Not if what you're saying is true. Catherine's eyes shone with pride. Oh, my brave boy, she murmured. With James now part of their alliance, they quickly brought him up to speed on their plans. His youth and tech savviness could be a valuable asset, especially when it came to digging up digital evidence. As they were leaving the boathouse, now with a new member in their secret coalition, James suddenly stopped. Wait, he said, his face pale. What about Lily, my sister? Does she know? Catherine shook her head. Not yet. We weren't sure how to tell her. James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Grace had seen Richard make 1,000 times when stressed. We have to tell her. She deserves to know. You're right, Catherine agreed. But we need to be careful. Lily's always been closer to your father. We don't know how she'll react. As they walked back towards the main house, the weight of their secret felt heavier than ever. They had made progress, but the road ahead was still long and fraught with danger. Grace couldn't help but marvel at how much her life had changed in just a few short days. From a simple housekeeper to the linchpin of a conspiracy to bring down one of the most powerful families in the state. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly surreal. As they neared the house, Catherine turned to Grace. Remember, act normal if you see Richard. As far as he knows, you're long gone. Grace nodded, her heart racing as she saw a figure moving behind one of the ground floor windows. Was it Richard? Had he seen them? Just then, James's phone buzzed. He looked at it and frowned. It's Dad. He wants to see me in his study right away. The three conspirators shared a worried look. Did Richard suspect something? Was their plan already in jeopardy? Be careful, Catherine warned her son. Don't let on that you know anything. James nodded grimly. I won't. But Mom, we can't keep this secret forever. Sooner or later, we'll have to confront him. As James headed into the house, Catherine turned to Grace. You should go. It's not safe for you to be here. Grace hesitated. What about you? Will you be okay? Catherine's smile was tired but determined. I've survived 25 years with Richard Blackwood. I can handle a few more days. Go. We'll be in touch soon. As Grace walked away from Blackwood Manor for the second time in as many days, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. For better or worse, the wheels were now in motion. Back in her small apartment, Grace carefully hid the USB drive containing their evidence. As she did, her phone buzzed with a text from James. Dad knows something's up. Be careful. Meeting tomorrow, same place, 3 p.m. Grace's heart raced. The stakes had just gotten higher. As she deleted the message, she wondered what new challenges tomorrow would bring. The next day, Grace arrived at the boathouse, well before the appointed time. Her nerves were on edge, every sound making her jump. The weight of the USB drive in her pocket felt like a ticking time bomb. As she waited, Grace's mind wandered to the Harrison family. Their story had stuck with her, a stark example of the human cost of the Blackwoods' greed. On a whim, she pulled out her phone and did a quick internet search. What she found made her blood run cold. The Harrison family had indeed fallen on hard times after losing their factory. The father, once a pillar of the community, had spiraled into depression and alcoholism. Their oldest son had been arrested several times for petty theft. But it was the fate of their daughter, Emily, that truly broke Grace's heart. Emily Harrison had been a bright, promising student when her family's world collapsed. Forced to drop out of college due to lack of funds, she'd struggled to find steady work. The last news article Grace could find mentioned Emily's ongoing battle with drug addiction. Grace's hands shook as she put away her phone. This was the real impact of the Blackwoods-wide actions. Not just numbers on a balance sheet, but shattered lives and broken dreams. Her resolve strengthened. They had to make this right, no matter the cost. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped Grace out of her thoughts. She tensed, ready to flee but relaxed, when she saw Catherine and James enter the boathouse. One look at their faces told Grace something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, her heart racing. James spoke first, his voice tight with stress. "Dad's definitely suspicious. He's been asking weird questions, watching us more closely. I think he might have noticed the safe had been opened." Catherine nodded grimly. "He's planning something. I can feel it. We need to move faster." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" "We can't wait any longer to start reaching out to the victims," Catherine said. "James and I have been going through the files. We've identified a few key people who might be willing to speak out." James pulled out a notebook. "I've got names, last known addresses. We need to start making contact, building our coalition." Grace nodded, her mind racing. "I can start with the Harristons. I did some research and, well, they've fallen on hard times. They might be eager for justice." As they discussed their plans, a new energy filled the small boathouse. They were no longer just planning and scheming. They were taking action. Suddenly, James held up a hand, silencing them. "Did you hear that?" They all froze, listening intently. At first, Grace heard nothing but the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. Then she caught it, the crunch of gravel under tires coming closer. "Someone's coming," Catherine whispered, her face pale. James peered out a grimy window. "It's Dad's car. He must have followed me." Panic gripped Grace. They were trapped. Catherine's mind, however, was racing. "Quick!" she hissed. "Grace, hide behind those old crates." "James, you were just showing me the old boathouse, remembering childhood summers." "Got it." They barely had time to get into position before the door creaked open. Richard Blackwood's imposing figure filled the doorway, his sharp eyes scanning the interior. "Well, well," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "What a quaint family outing. Mind if I join?" Catherine plastered on a smile. "Richard, what a lovely surprise. James was just showing me around, for old times' sake." Richard's gaze swept the boathouse, lingering on the dark corners where Grace hid. "Indeed, how nostalgic of you." He took a step inside and Grace held her breath. One wrong move, one misplaced shadow, and she'd be discovered. "You know," Richard continued, his tone conversational but with an undercurrent of menace. "It's funny. I've been noticing some strange things lately. Missing files, whispered conversations that stop when I enter a room." His eyes locked onto James. "Suspicious behavior from my own son." James met his father's gaze steadily. "I don't know what you're talking about, Dad." Richard's laugh was cold and humorless. "No? Then perhaps you can explain why you've suddenly taken such an interest in our family's financial history?" The tension in the room was palpable. Grace's heart pounded so loudly she was sure Richard must hear it. Catherine stepped forward, placing herself between Richard and James. "Richard, please, what's this all about?" For a moment, Richard's mask slipped, and Grace saw raw fury in his eyes. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual smooth charm. "Nothing, my dear," he said, smiling tightly. "Just a father's concern for his family. But I can see I'm interrupting your nostalgia. I'll leave you to it." He turned to go, but paused at the doorway. "Oh, and Catherine? I've scheduled a little family dinner for tonight. I expect everyone to be there. We have much to discuss." With that, he was gone. They waited, barely breathing, until the sound of his car faded into the distance. Grace emerged from her hiding spot, her legs shaky. "That was too close," she gasped. Catherine nodded, her face grim. He knows something's up. We're running out of time. James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration Grace had seen Richard make countless times. What do we do now? Catherine's eyes blazed with determination. We accelerate the plan. Grace, can you start contacting people today? We need as many allies as we can get, as quickly as possible. Grace nodded. I'll start with the Harristons. If we can get them on board, others might follow. Good, Catherine said. James and I will go to this family dinner. We'll try to keep Richard distracted, maybe even fish for more information. As they finalized their plans, Grace couldn't shake a feeling of foreboding. They were playing a dangerous game, and Richard Blackwood was not a man to be underestimated. Later that afternoon, Grace found herself standing outside a rundown apartment building on the outskirts of town. According to her research, this was where Emily Harriston now lived. Taking a deep breath, Grace climbed the crumbling steps and knocked on apartment 3B. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. The woman who peered out bore little resemblance to the smiling teenager Grace remembered from old news clippings. Emily Harriston's once bright eyes were dull and suspicious, her face gaunt and lined beyond her years. "Yeah?" Emily said, her voice raspy. "What do you want?" Grace swallowed hard. "Ms. Harriston, my name is Grace Johnson. I have some information about what happened to your family's company, information that could change everything." Emily's eyes narrowed. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No joke," Grace said earnestly. "Please just hear me out. It's about the Blackwoods." At the mention of that name, something flickered in Emily's eyes. A spark of the old fire Grace remembered. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped back, opening the door wider. "You've got 5 minutes," Emily said. "This better be good." As Grace stepped into the small, cluttered apartment, she sent up a silent prayer. Everything hinged on this moment, on her ability to convince this broken woman to join their cause. Meanwhile, back at Blackwood Manor, Catherine and James were preparing for the most tense family dinner of their lives. As they descended the grand staircase, Catherine whispered to her son, "Remember, act normal. We can't let him suspect anything." James nodded grimly. "Got it. But Mom, what if he already knows everything?" Catherine's grip on the banister tightened. "Then we'll deal with that when it comes. For now, just follow my lead." They entered the dining room to find Richard already seated at the head of the table, a glass of wine in hand and a predatory smile on his face. "Ah, there you are," he said, his voice silky smooth. "Please, sit down. We have so much to discuss." As Catherine and James took their seats, the air thick with unspoken tension, Richard raised his glass in a mocking toast. "To family," he said, his eyes glittering dangerously. "And to the interesting times that lie ahead." The tension in the Blackwood dining room was palpable as Catherine and James took their seats. Lily, Richard, and Catherine's daughter was already there, looking confused and slightly worried. Richard sat at the head of the table, swirling his wine glass with an air of casual menace. "Now then," he said, his voice deceptively light. "Shall we begin?" Catherine forced a smile. "Of course, dear. What's the occasion for this unexpected family gathering?" Richard's eyes glinted. "Oh, I just thought it was time we had a frank discussion about the future of this family and about loyalty." James tensed visibly, but Catherine laid a calming hand on his arm under the table. "Loyalty?" Lily asked, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean, Dad?" Richard smiled at his daughter, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, sweetheart, it seems some members of this family have been keeping secrets. Big secrets." Catherine's heart raced, but she kept her face neutral. "Richard, I'm not sure what you're implying, but—" "Oh, I think you know exactly what I'm implying, Catherine." Richard cut her off, his voice sharp. "The safe in my study, the missing files, the whispered conversations. Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" James opened his mouth to speak, but Catherine squeezed his arm in warning. She met Richard's gaze steadily. "If you have something to say, Richard, then say it." Richard's facade of calm cracked, anger seeping through. "Fine. Let's lay our cards on the table, shall we?" I know you've been snooping into the family's finances. I know you've discovered things you think you shouldn't have. And I know you've been plotting against me." Lily gasped, her eyes wide. "Mom? James? What's he talking about?" Catherine took a deep breath. This was it, the moment of truth. "Richard, the things we've discovered, they're unconscionable. The fraud, the extortion, the lives ruined. How could you?" Richard slammed his fist on the table, making the china rattle. "How could I? I did what was necessary to secure our family's future, to give you all the life you're accustomed to." "At what cost?" James interjected, his voice shaking with anger. "Do you have any idea how many people you've hurt?" Lily looked between her family members, confusion and horror dawning on her face. "Will someone please tell me what's going on?" Catherine turned to her daughter, her heart breaking. "Lily, sweetheart, the truth is, our family's wealth, it wasn't earned honestly. Your father, your grandfather, they built it through illegal means, by hurting innocent people." Lily shook her head in disbelief. No, that can't be true, Dad." Richard's face was a mask of cold fury. "It's more complicated than that, Lily. Sometimes in business, hard decisions have to be made. Sacrifices." "Sacrifices?" James interrupted, his voice rising. "Is that what you call ruining people's lives, driving them to poverty, to addiction?" Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "Enough. I've worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let you destroy everything now. Whatever you think you know, whatever evidence you think you have, it stops here. Tonight," Catherine stood as well, facing her husband. "No, Richard, it's too late for that. We can't keep living this lie. We can't keep profiting from other people's misery." "Can't we?" Richard's voice was dangerously soft. "And what exactly do you plan to do, Catherine? Go to the authorities? The media? You'll destroy this family. Is that what you want?" Before Catherine could respond, there was a commotion from the hallway. The dining room door burst open, and Grace rushed in, breathless and disheveled. "Catherine!" she gasped. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this." Richard's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in fury. "You!" he snarled. "I should have known you'd be involved in this, Johnson. I told you never to set foot in this house again." Grace ignored him, her eyes locked on Catherine. "I've been to see Emily Harrison. She's agreed to speak out, to tell her story. And she's not the only one. Others are coming forward too." Catherine felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly tempered by fear as she saw the look on Richard's face. "You fools," he hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The people I've dealt with, the promises I've made. If this gets out, we're all in danger. Not just our reputation, our wealth, our lives." Lily, who had been watching the scene unfold in stunned silence, finally found her voice. "Dad, is it true? All of it?" Richard's anger seemed to deflate, replaced by a weariness that aged him years in moments. He sank back into his chair, suddenly looking old and defeated. "Yes," he said quietly. "It's true, all of it." The admission hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Catherine stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Richard, it's over. We can't keep living like this. We need to make things right." Richard looked up at her, his eyes haunted. "And how do you propose we do that, Catherine? How do we undo decades of this?" It was James who answered, his voice steady. "We start by telling the truth, all of it. We use our resources to help the people we've hurt. We face the consequences of our actions." Richard laughed bitterly. "Just like that? You think it's that simple?" "No," Catherine said. "It won't be simple or easy, but it's necessary." As the family grappled with the weight of their new reality, Grace stood quietly by the door, feeling like an intruder in this intensely personal moment. But she knew her presence was crucial. She was the link to the outside world, to the people whose lives had been affected by the Blackwoods' actions. Suddenly, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Blue and red lights flashed through the windows, growing closer. Richard's head snapped up, panic in his eyes. "What have you done?" Catherine looked just as surprised. "This wasn't us. We didn't call the police." Grace's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her eyes widening as she read the message. "It's Emily Harrison," she said. She went to the police on her own, told them everything she knew." The sound of car doors slamming and footsteps on gravel grew louder. The Blackwoods looked at each other, a mix of fear and resignation on their faces. Catherine took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Well," she said, her voice steady, "I suppose this is it. The moment of truth." James nodded, moving to stand beside his mother. Lily, after a moment's hesitation, joined them. Richard remained seated, his head in his hands. "It's over," he muttered. "Everything I built, gone." Catherine looked at her husband, a complex mix of emotions in her eyes. "No, Richard, this is where we start rebuilding. The right way this time." As the sound of knocking echoed through the mansion, the Blackwood family stood together, united for perhaps the first time in years. They were facing an uncertain future, one that would undoubtedly be filled with challenges and hardships. But as Grace watched them, she felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps out of the ashes of the Blackwoods' ill-gotten empire, something good could rise, something honest and true. The knocking grew more insistent. Catherine took a deep breath, then nodded to Grace. "Let them in," she said. As Grace moved to open the door, she couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed in just a few short days. From a simple housekeeper to a key player in exposing one of the biggest scandals their town had ever seen. The door swung open, revealing a group of stern-faced police officers. "Mr. Blackwood," the lead officer said, "we have some questions for you." Richard stood slowly, his face a mask of resignation. "Yes," he said quietly, "I expect you do." As the officers entered the room, Grace caught Catherine's eye. The older woman gave her a small, sad smile and a nod of thanks. Whatever happened next, the truth was finally out. And that, Grace realized, was the first step towards real justice. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. The arrest of Richard Blackwood sent shockwaves through the community. As news of the family's fraudulent activities spread, more victims came forward, each with their own story of how the Blackwoods' greed had impacted their lives. Grace found herself at the center of it all, working tirelessly alongside Catherine and James to help coordinate the efforts to make amends. They set up a foundation, using a significant portion of the Blackwood fortune to provide restitution to those who had been wronged. One crisp autumn morning, Grace stood outside the newly renovated community center. It had once been the Harrison family's factory, abandoned and left to rot after Richard's machinations had forced its closure. Now it was a symbol of renewal, offering job training, counseling services, and support for those struggling to rebuild their lives. As she watched people filing in for the grand opening, Grace spotted a familiar face in the crowd. Emily Harrison, looking healthier and more hopeful than when Grace had first met her, was chatting animatedly with a group of young people. "Quite a turnout," a voice said beside her. Grace turned to see Catherine, a small smile on her tired face. Grace nodded. "It's amazing to see. I never thought any of this would be possible." Catherine's smile turned wistful. "Neither did I. But here we are." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as James directed volunteers, and Lily handed out information packets to newcomers. "Any word on Richard?" Grace asked softly. Catherine's expression tightened slightly. "The trial is set for next month. His lawyers are still trying to negotiate a plea deal, but it doesn't look good. He'll likely spend a significant amount of time in prison." Grace hesitated, then placed a comforting hand on Catherine's arm. Despite everything, she knew this was still hard for the other woman. Richard had been her husband for decades, the father of her children. Those bonds weren't easily broken, even in the face of his crimes. "How are you holding up?" Grace asked. Catherine took a deep breath. "It's difficult. Some days I'm angry, furious at him for what he's done, for the lies he told us all. Other days I find myself missing him, and then I feel guilty for it." She shook her head. "But mostly, I'm focused on this, on making things right as much as we can." Before Grace could respond, they were interrupted by Emily Harrison approaching. "Mrs. Blackwood? Miss Johnson?" Emily said, her voice tentative but her eyes clear and determined. I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done. This place, it's going to help so many people." Catherine smiled warmly. "We're just trying to set things right, Emily. And please call me Catherine." Emily nodded, then turned to Grace. "And thank you, Ms. Johnson, for coming to find me that day, for giving me the courage to speak up. I don't know if I would have had the strength without you." Grace felt a lump form in her throat. "You're stronger than you know, Emily. All I did was give you a little push." As Emily moved away to greet more arrivals, James approached his mother and Grace. "It's time," he said. "They're ready for us to make the opening speech." Catherine took a deep breath, smoothing down her jacket. "Right, let's do this." As they made their way to the makeshift stage, Grace couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them here, from a hidden letter in a dusty office to this moment of hope and renewal. It hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but they were facing them together. Catherine stepped up to the microphone, her posture straight and her voice clear as she addressed the gathered crowd. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. As many of you know, the story of how we came to this moment is not an easy one to tell. It's a story of greed, of mistakes, and of terrible wrongs done to many of you and your families." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "But it's also a story of truth, of courage, and of the power of coming together to right those wrongs. This community center stands as a promise that we will do everything in our power to make amends, to offer support, and to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again." As Catherine continued her speech, Grace found her gaze drawn to the back of the crowd. There, partially hidden in the shadow of a tree, stood a figure she recognized all too well. Lily, the youngest Blackwood, was watching the proceedings with a mix of emotions playing across her face. Grace made her way through the crowd, coming to stand beside the young woman. "Lily," she said softly, "are you all right?" Lily started slightly, then gave Grace a weak smile. "Oh, hi, Grace. I don't know. It's all still so overwhelming." Grace nodded in understanding. Of all the Blackwoods, Lily had perhaps struggled the most with the revelations about her family. She'd been kept in the dark for so long, and the truth had shaken her to her core. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed," Grace said gently. "What your family is doing here, what you're a part of, it's huge. It's life-changing for so many people." Lily's eyes filled with tears. "But it doesn't erase what my father did, what our family name was built on. Sometimes I feel like I don't deserve to be here, to be part of this." Grace placed a comforting hand on Lily's shoulder. "Listen to me, Lily. You are not responsible for your father's actions. What matters is what you choose to do now, how you choose to move forward. And from what I've seen, you're choosing to help, to be part of the solution. That counts for a lot." Lily wiped her eyes, offering Grace a watery smile. "Thank you, Grace. I'm trying. It's just hard sometimes." "I know," Grace said. "But you're not alone. You have your mother, your brother, and, well, you have me too, if you ever need someone to talk to." As they turned their attention back to the stage, where James was now speaking about the various programs the center would offer, Grace felt a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't a perfect ending. There was still so much work to be done, so many lives to help rebuild, but it was a start. The crowd erupted in applause as James concluded his speech. As people began to file into the center for tours and sign-ups, Grace found herself hanging back, taking in the scene. She thought about how different her life had been just a few months ago. A housekeeper, invisible and overlooked, keeping the secrets of a family she served but never truly knew. Now she stood here, an integral part of a movement for change and justice. Catherine approached her, a spark of excitement in her eyes that Grace hadn't seen in years. "Grace, there you are. We're about to start the tours. Would you like to lead one? After all, none of this would have been possible without you." Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest. "I'd be honored, Catherine. But this is all of us. We did this together." As they walked towards the entrance of the center, Grace caught sight of her reflection in one of the gleaming new windows. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her, confident, purposeful, a far cry from the timid housekeeper she'd once been. The journey had been difficult, filled with fear, doubt, and moments of despair. But standing here now, seeing the hope on the faces of those entering the center, Grace knew it had all been worth it. She'd always believed that one person could make a difference, but she'd never imagined that person could be her. Yet here she was, proof that sometimes all it takes is the courage to speak up, to stand for what's right, even when it seems impossible. As Grace prepared to lead her group on the tour, she took one last look around. The old factory, once a symbol of corruption and greed, now stood as a beacon of hope and renewal. It was a testament to the power of truth, to the strength found in coming together for a common cause. And as she began to speak, telling the story of how this place came to be, Grace realized that this wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning for her, for the Blackwoods, and for every person whose life would be touched by the work they were doing here. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But now, they faced it together, united in their commitment to right the wrongs of the past and build a better future. As the sun shone brightly overhead, casting its warm light over the bustling community center, Grace couldn't help but smile. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, truly valued. And she knew, deep in her heart, that the best was yet to come.